Hello, everyone. I am Virginia Cole, the Archaeology and Classics Librarian here at Cornell University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this Chats in the Stacks book talk with Professor Michael Fontaine. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Cornell University Library's Chats in the Stacks book talk series, now in its 16th year, is dedicated to providing faculty authors an opportunity to share their recently published books with a cross-disciplinary audience. And that audience is growing larger all the time. In this last year, the pandemic forced our transition to a virtual format. And while we look forward to a time in which we can again safely welcome in-person audiences for events like this, we are cheered to see that so many are joining us from all over the world. Certainly a silver lining to this new way of doing things. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I would like to mention that a question and answer session will follow our speaker's presentation. Please feel free to type your question for Professor Fontaine into the chat box at any time, and we will get to as many as we can during this session. And please let us know if you would like me to use your name when I ask the question for you. And now, without further ado, let me introduce Professor Michael Fontaine. And because I haven't heard Mike's talk today, and I haven't yet learned how to tell a good joke, please don't expect my introduction to have funny punchlines. Mike Fontaine received his BA in Classics from Millsaps College and his PhD in Classics from Brown University. He is a professor in the Classics department at Cornell, specializing in Latin literature of all time periods and classical Roman, Greek, and Renaissance society. He is involved in the Living Latin Language program, which has become quite popular at Cornell, and serves on the advisory board of the Paideia Institute and the Polis Institute. He served as the Paideia Institute Professor of Living Latin in Rome in 2016 and 14, back when it was possible to travel to Italy. Mike is a man of varied interest and many talents. After the publication of a translation of How to Drink, a classical guide to the art of imbibing, he published Poetry and Best American Poetry, op-eds in US Today and Psychology Today, and articles in the Daily Beast and Time magazine related to the history of drinking culture and its relationship to masculinity. He's held a variety of administrative positions at Cornell, including Associate Vice Provost of Undergraduate Education and Associate Dean of the University Faculty. He's authored numerous journal articles, chapters, and books, most notably Funny Words in Plautina Comedy, Oxford University Press, 2010. The Oxford Handbook of Greek and Roman Comedy, 2014, co-edited with Adele Scafuro, which is currently being translated into Arabic. And most recently, 2 editions of Cicero, both from Princeton University Press, How to Grieve, an Ancient Guide to Moving On, and How to Tell a Joke, an Ancient Guide to the Art of Humor, the subject of today's talk. Forthcoming from Princeton University Press, we can look forward to his 2 new editions, particularly suited to these unusual times. Ovid's How to Get Over a Breakup, and Prudentius's How to Cope, an Ancient Guide to Tough Times. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Michael Fontaine.
So, hey, everybody, welcome so much. I'm so glad to have you all here. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see if we can get this started. let's see. I'm gonna share my screen and you'll see our stunt picture to get started. There it is. So welcome everybody. That's me, I'm Mike Fontaine. And this is the book, How to Tell a Joke. So welcome, I'm gonna start with a question. Whoops. Here we go, let's start with a question. This is from the book. A Roman soldier walks into a bar, goes over to the bartender, holds up 2 fingers in a V and says, 5, please. So maybe you laughed at that, maybe you didn't laugh at that, but I started with a joke for a reason that's in the book. It's to soften you up, as we'll be talking about, to talk about humor. So this is the book here, How to Tell a Joke. The subtitle, An Ancient Guide to the Art of Humor, and I am incredibly excited to be talking about this, to put this book together. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it and some of the background, but I want to start with one proposition. First of all, it's that humor has been around for a long time, and it fits into this series coming out from Princeton University Press. We have a really inspired editor over there, and it's called Ancient Wisdom for Modern Readers. The idea is to take practical knowledge, actionable advice from ancient authors, and put these things into modern practice today, despite the passage of time. So here's my wine and cheese for you. So last year, just about this time, I was supposed to talk to you about this one, How to Drink, a classical guide to the art of imbibing. But COVID shut that down, so you didn't get to talk. So if you want to know what's in that, you're going to have to buy the book. So that actually does work out pretty well for me. But today I'm going to talk about the cheese, how to tell a joke. I got a lot of cheesy jokes. So if you're lactose intolerant, this is not the right show for you. Okay, here's the book. And here's a proposition, an idea that I got from the book itself. In the real world, you don't really see magic, but jokes are as close to magic as we get in the real world. And what do we know about magic? Well, all magic spells, like Faustus here, all magic spells, all hidden arcane knowledge, all secrets. So that stuff's all in Latin. And so what have I done? I have translated it from this old Latin into contemporary English. And in a way, you could say I'm like Prometheus here on the left, famous in mythology for stealing fire from heaven. I'm stealing firecrackers from heaven. Or you could say I'm like this nice serpent climbing the tree over here, handing the forbidden fruit to Adam and Eve. Why? Because jokes can go either way. They're very risky. You can get far in life with them, but you can also self-destruct. So that's going to be one of the lessons of the book. Okay, one point I want to make right away is that for me, this is a really amazing moment to bring these ideas together. This is sort of worlds collide for me. So I've spent, as Virginia told us, my whole career studying humor since a dissertation on the topic almost 20 years ago. But this book actually grows out of my more recent experience in various leadership roles around Cornell. The last decade, I've been running around Day Hall in various capacities. And what have I learned? I've learned in all these different settings that in leadership roles, administrative roles, getting along, humor has saved the day countless times. And I'm talking about project management, internal debates over policy, public debates over policy, diplomacy, meeting new colleagues everywhere, trying to foster a sense of community and common purpose. Humor has been the secret for all this. So what else do I want to say? One of the things I've learned is that many, many professional people are actually kind of scared of humor. They want to use it, but they're afraid of trying it. They're worried about compromising their dignity. And as you look around, there really isn't a book like this out there. And I'm thinking of anybody involved in public speaking, business people, lawyers, teachers of all kinds. If you have to talk to the public, there are rules that will help you. And I'm so excited about this that I'll talk about it at the end, but I've teamed up with eCornell. That's the executive education arm of Cornell University to actually build a couple of courses around what Cicero has to tell us. The principles in the book are universal. They're timeless. At this point, they're 2,100 years old, and they're actually proven. And I'll tell you how we know that. And to my amazement, there's all kinds of pop psychology. There's all kinds of social science, and there's various neuroscience even about humor. But nobody's actually given you the algorithms that'll make this all work, or the principles of why it works. But ancient Greece had worked all this out a long time ago. Okay, so let's get rid of me and meet the man behind the mic. This is Cicero here. You can see we had photoshopped a microphone into his hand where there was once a papyrus scroll. So he's not just a marble statue. There's a very talented artist in Florence today, a gentleman named Alessandro Tomasi, who gave me permission to share his photorealistic recreation of Cicero here. So this is what the guy probably looked like way back when. I gave you the dates there, 106 to 43 BCE. So Cicero died 43 years before Jesus was born in another part of the Roman Empire. So as we look at this, there are actually two people in the book. So the other one who didn't get top billing on the cover is this guy named Quintilian. He lived about 150 years after Cicero, and he was a little bit different. So Quintilian was like me. He was a professor. He actually held the first ever chair of Latin literature in the Roman Empire. And he was someone who spent his whole career distilling the best practices. He would study what sort of the other people had to do in public, and he would write a textbook or textbook rules based on what he had seen in records. But over on the right, we have Cicero. He is the consul of ancient Rome in his time. We have to be careful here because that's an English word today, consul, but it doesn't mean the same thing. In ancient Rome, consul means president. In ancient Rome, there were actually two presidents every year, rather than one president every 4 years, but that's basically how it worked. In his year, Cicero was the consul, he was the president. Okay, so about the book. So why do I say nobody's really done this before? Well, the key word there is selected. Both of the treatises that I've translated for this book are actually drawn from longer handbooks, one written by Cicero and one written by Quintilian. And they're both master textbooks on the art of public speaking. And what has happened is these are definitely separate modules. They are separable. If this were Canvas, the learning management system, this would be a module within there. But they've sort of gotten lost because they get buried midway through the handbooks they're found in. So here's the cover page. Let's talk a little bit about it. What's in this thing? All right, so I told you jokes are magic. And that sounds a little grandiose. You say, what? Jokes aren't magic. Why would you say jokes aren't magic? Well, it's one of the first things that Cicero says. All right, this is actually Quintilian here. Quintilian says, laughter seems like a minor thing, something that any stand-up comedian, any street performer, any idiot can get a laugh. He says, nevertheless, laughter does have this certain overpowering and conquering force where all resistance is futile. Now ask yourself, isn't that true? Have you ever tried to stifle a laugh and you just couldn't do it? He says, what? It often erupts from us, even against our will. It not only squeezes a confession from the face and voice, but it even rocks the whole body forcefully. This is an amazing thing, this laughter. And this is the key point. Laughter can change the course of the most serious matters, since it zaps anger and animosity with great frequency. This is sort of a neat idea. Quintilian, he doesn't know anything, of course, about chemicals or even necessarily blood pressure, but he recognizes on the macro level that laughter is doing something to the inside of the body that breaks up emotions. And here's the example. He says, well, here's a famous example that proves what I'm saying. These teenagers in the southern Italian city of Tarentum, once upon a time, at a dinner party where they were all drinking, they said a lot of nasty things about King Pyrrhus, the king. When these guys got brought in the next day to explain themselves, and there was no denying or defending what they said, they escaped with a laugh and a well-timed joke. When the king said, what do you guys have to say for yourselves? One of them quipped, no, man, if we hadn't run out of booze, we would have killed you. And poof. That witticism, says Quintilian, melted away all the hard feelings over the charge. These guys were going to get executed, and they got let go because the king got the giggles. Okay, so how exactly does this magic of laughter work? So here we are in Cicero's treatise. I call it the Caesarean section because in it, the speaker of this section is a guy named Caesar. And he says, let's think about laughter, right? I mean, there's 5 fundamental questions. He says, I don't want to keep you waiting any longer. I'll outline the whole shebang. When it comes to laughter, there's 5 questions to ask. Number 1, what is it? Number 2, where does laughter come from? Number 3, should a public speaker, an orator, want to make people laugh? Number 4, if yes, well, how much? And number 5, the longest section, what are the different kinds of jokes? He says, well, as for number 1, what laughter actually is, how laughter is aroused, where it dwells, themselves, how it arises and erupts so suddenly that we can't stop it even though we want to, and how it can simultaneously take over the sides, the mouth, the cheeks, the eyes, the face. He says, I don't know, go ask Democritus about all that, because none of it's relevant to what we're interested in. And even if it were, I'd have no trouble admitting I'm clueless, since even those who claim they do know, they don't. What does he mean? He's saying, go ask some philosopher, some neuroscientist, somebody who studies the brain, of where laughter comes from. He says, we're not interested in how it works. We're only interested in that it works. It's usable, however it does work. So he says, all right, now let's think about this. Now, if you're a public speaker, well, then yes, it clearly is in your public speaking interest to make people laugh. Why? Well, number one, when you give people the giggles, tell them a joke about the Roman numeral 5, when you give people the giggles, they side with you reflexively. He says, everybody admires a zinger, even one concentrated in a single word, especially in a comeback, though also as a first strike. Now we can get practical. Laughter crushes your opponent, trips him up, ridicules him, deters him, defeats him. So you can bully people with laughter. He says it shows you that the orator himself is sophisticated, that he gets it, that he's educated, urbane, he's one of us. And most of all, because laughter eases hurt. It breaks the tension. And when problematic facts can't be argued away, a joke and laugh often make them go poof. And that was what we saw with the teenagers in Tarentum. They were guilty as heck. There was no way out. So the laugh was the only way they could do it, and it worked. Now here's a quote from a poet who lived maybe a generation after Cicero, Horace. He says, this is quite profound. He says, a joke usually cuts through matters of importance more efficiently and more effectively than severity. So think about it, right? Have you ever gotten angry about something, some policy, maybe your school district or the way the university is being run or something happening at workplace? What do? Well, you can organize a campaign, you can write a letter to the editor, you can complain, you can take to Twitter, whatever it is you want to do, you can do all this. But Horace thinks that sometimes a joke is more effective. I want to give you a case study that I remember from about 10 years ago. 10 years ago at Ohio State, they had a football coach, Jim Tressel. He had an amazing year. Jim Tressel, the football coach, he beat Michigan. He won a BCS bowl game. And he finished the season ranked number 5 in the nation. For that work as football coach of Ohio State, Tressel was paid $3.5 million and given numerous perks, including a private jet for 20 hours worth another $500,000. So in 1 year, this football coach got about $4 million compensation. This caused an outrage. The Ohio State University president of the whole system, Gordon Gee, was asked whether he'd given any thought in light of all this to firing the football coach for the scandal that erupted. His response was a joke. He said, I'm just hoping that the coach doesn't dismiss me. And what does that say? Boom, the mask drops, right? What does it show? The emperor, I, the emperor, am announcing the emperor has no clothes. Who's really in charge here? Is it the university president or is it the football coach? And this became just a joke that seared in my brain. It was so successful, so influential. It got him out of all the hot water that no explaining ever could have done. Okay, so let's say you want to use laughter in public speaking. Well, then the question becomes, how far should you take it? How far should an orator take the laughs? Cicero says we need to scrutinize this with extreme care. And here is a mantra that took me forever to figure out how to translate, so I'm quite proud of it. I'm sharing it. Quintilian sums this up. He says, humor is risky since wit is so close to twit. It's a very fine line between being witty and between twitting somebody or being a nitwit or being a twit, some annoying pest. He says, you're going to have to be really careful. And he's got practical strategies how to handle that. And I make this point because what happened? In the year 43 BCE, Cicero himself was assassinated by a guy named Mark Antony, famous for being the lover of Cleopatra. So why? Why was Cicero assassinated? I'm going to answer that question in just a minute, but I want to go back to the beginning of my book and I'll back into why, for one reason, he was assassinated. Here's how I begin my book, How to Tell a Joke. I wrote a sort of a longish introduction. I said, so is humor a teachable skill or is it something you're born with? Well, a couple thousand years ago, Cicero had some thoughts about that. Now I quote a guy who lived about 500 years later than Cicero, but he was quoting contemporary sources. And this guy looks back and he says, the two most eloquent men that antiquity produced, the comedian Plautus and the orator Cicero, were also its two best at telling jokes. Who doesn't know that Cicero's enemies routinely used to call him the stand-up consul? And that's a remarkable phrase. And it's ambiguous in English, right? So they're not saying he was a good fella, that he was a solid, reliable guy. They were saying that Cicero was a consul of the Roman Republic who behaved like a stand-up comedian. Here's an example. There was a candidate running for political office one time whose father was believed to be a cook. So that guy went to ask a man for his vote, and Cicero, who was standing by, he piped up, "Roast assured, I'll support you." It's kind of stupid, right? It's a little pun. And so Quintilian looks back, he says, that kind of joke is verging on stand-up comedy. That's not really what we expect from a presidential type person. So I editorialize. I say Quintilian's right to be concerned. The line between wit and buffoonery can pose a serious threat to your dignity. But here's the thing. It can also, as Cicero knew, be a source of power. As he emphasizes in his own discussion, humor can collapse the distinction between an orator and a comedian. Humor can collapse the distinction between a political rally and stand-up comedy. And if you do it just right, it'll bring you social and political power, even an election. That's a pretty amazing thought. And right or wrong, jokes are going to be the keys that unlock that power, that social power. The joke is the measurable unit. Plutarch was an ancient biographer of Cicero. He looked back and he says, this guy Cicero was really something. He would ignore protocol at trials, murder trials. He would kid around. He would use irony to laugh away serious arguments. The point, says Plutarch, was to win. Cicero was fixated on winning the trial, and he would ridicule other people or his opposing counsel, the person being prosecuted, whatever it took to win the case. Now, there's a famous moment in the treatise I translated for you. Cicero has one of his characters say, and you'll know this if you're like me. Cicero's character says, that's the hardest thing for quick-witted people to do, to take stock of the people and the circumstances. That is to say, to read the room, and to hold back the quips that come to mind, even when it would be totally hilarious to say them. So if you have a gift for comedy or you're a naturally humorous person, sometimes you're sitting through a meeting and somebody says something, and within you're flooding into your consciousness 3, 4, 7 different puns, jokes, anything, and you have got to bite your tongue. Well, Cicero says that is actually the hardest thing for a lot of people to do. Cicero himself is telling us this, but it didn't work. Cicero failed to heed his own advice, and it cost him his life. In the last year of his life, Cicero, I wrote this in the book, this is an intermezzo I wrote in there. Cicero was hunted down and murdered 12 years after publishing this treatise, this masterpiece. The Goon Squad was sent by Mark Antony, a politician turned warlord that Cicero had roasted in a merciless series of political speeches called the Philippics. So the Philippics was the sort of dozen speeches. Some had policy, but some of them were like the meanest Comedy Central roast you can imagine, ridiculing this politician over and over and over. And finally, it came back to haunt Cicero. So he was doing his best to try and neutralize Antony, and it backfired spectacularly. Okay, so enough on Cicero himself. Let's think about what is humor? What exactly is it? Okay, here's something else I wrote in the introduction. I said, it's a funny thing. In Latin, this word humor means biochemical. And today we talk about chemicals and chemical balances. Well, the ancients talked about humors and humoral balances. And I said, people in ancient Rome, they knew nothing about genes, but they knew plenty about genetics. They weren't stupid. They could see that some characteristics are required and others are innate. In fact, innate comes from the Latin word for genetics, natura, which means the condition of your birth. And of course, the Romans could also see predispositions. It was obvious then, just as it is today, that certain abilities just come more easily to some of us than to others. Sports, singing, public speaking, even telling a joke. So in theory, if you were born with just the right balance of humors, like a Cicero, you would be a humorous person. You'd be a wit, or to use the Latin word, a natural. You would be a genetic genius. Okay, but what if you weren't, right? What if you're not a natural? Could you become one with rules? Or if you were a natural, can you get even better? Can you hone your craft? So that question brings us to Cicero's treatise, the longest extant discussion of humor that we have from the ancient world. How does he present it? So this is still from my introduction. Well, I say, if you've got a good idea to share with the world, there's a few different ways you can present it. You can write an article or give a TED Talk. That's very popular these days, the sage on a stage. You could write it into a poem. I'm not aware of anybody doing this today, but it used to be pretty popular. Or you can make it into a movie. So the last option, the movie, is the traditional format for humanistic learning. So instead of just telling us what to think, that's the lazy, easy option, the one Quintilian chose. It's the one I chose to talk to you today. Cicero created what the ancients called a dialogue, a movie script. And he constructed an imaginary world for readers to animate inside their heads. He creates real characters, complete with individual personalities. And he distributes all his thoughts on humor among them so they can talk about the ideas out and decide what seems best. Whoops. Okay. And then I talked a little bit about the translation. I say styles of translation vary. Some are literal. In fact, these two treatises in the past have been literal. Others go for the gist, but this one goes for the jest. And why not? We should go for the jest. So this was actually the hardest part of the whole thing, was racking my brains trying to figure out how I'm going to convey these ideas in English of today. So I've just pulled a few examples out. Inconsistencies. I translated one example. That guy has it all, except for money and redeeming qualities. Those of you in the audience who know a little Latin will see it's shorter. But if I were to translate the words down there as, what is away from this person except thing and excellence, it's probably not going to mean too much. So I had to try and think, how are people getting that same idea across today in a way that would be funny? Okay, here's another example from the very beginning of Cicero's speech. A character says, yeah, here's the thing. Jokes actually come in two forms. The first kind permeate an entire speech, while the other come fast and razor sharp. The ancients called the first kind shtick, and they called the second kind a sick burn. So these are the words that I'm translating here, cavillatio and dicacitas. And the character says both have funny names, which makes sense, since the whole business of making people laugh is, well, funny stuff. So there's a lot going on in the passage here, and I had to try and think of funny names in English for what he's talking about. I thought shtick was pretty good, and sick burn, I got some help from the neighborhood children on that one. They assured me that's what people are saying today. And what I noticed in translating this, where he says funny names, funny stuff in purple, there's a pun in the Latin, which is hard to see because it's not pronounced aloud, but he's punning on two different ones, where the first one he says it's a lighthearted name because this whole business is kind of slippery. And this is kind of cool if you're a word fan like I am. He signals the pun with this word quippe. Quippe in Latin means sure, right. But in time it gets sarcastic, it means, oh yeah, sure, right. And over time in English, we drop the last PE, and that gives us our word quip, meaning a joke. I just thought, just for one small sample, I'd show you, as I'm trying to translate these concepts up here, for the last one I came up with verbal jujitsu. And somebody I showed this to said, well, Cicero would not have said jujitsu. I said, that's probably true. However, if we had to say jujitsu in Latin, it would probably come out looking something like the words I translated. Okay, one more thing on the translation is, I was kind of proud of this one because it took me forever. There's this long category of jokes that he calls sub absurda, and the lazy me would have translated that as sub absurd or slightly absurd. But at long last, I realized it's what in English we call non sequiturs, which is a Latin phrase. It's just not the Latin phrase Cicero used. Okay, enough of the theoretics. Let's talk about some jokes. What made the Romans laugh or think that they could get people to laugh with it? One of the categories that Quintilian focuses on is what happens when you need to tell a joke when you've been thrust into the spotlight and you want to get out fast, right? You've been called up by the New York Times because of some turmoil at the office. You don't want to give a quote to the New York Times, but you kind of have to. What are you going to do to get out of trouble? Something like this. He says, one good example is shifting. He says, a funny example is the denial of this guy, Quintus Curius. He was on trial. The prosecution of this guy made a visual presentation for the judges in which, in every image, this guy, Quintus Curius, was either sitting naked in the public stocks or getting bailed out at the poker table by his friends. Curius quipped, "Sheesh, didn't I ever win?" You shift the grounds on people. Okay, here's another one. There are also these statements that in order to underplay or exaggerate something, they surprise us by going totally over the top. For instance, in one public speech, this guy named Crassus quipped, "Memmius thinks he's such a towering figure that when he comes into the forum, he has to duck under the Fabian arch." And there, insert the badum-tish for this kind of thing. Here's another one. An upper middle class guy produced a model justification. This one comes from Quintilian when we're in the Roman Empire. So this guy blew through his entire inheritance. Let's say this kid had a trust fund. Yay, his parents gave it to him. He's 21 and it's all gone by age 22. The emperor reprimanded him and he quipped, "I thought it was mine." The Romans thought that was funny. Another example is a quip that the great general Scipio made in Numantia in Spain. They say he was so angry at this stupid guy that he said, if his mother had had one more kid, it would have been a donkey. Now, I hope that that's at least sort of funny in English. It's actually better in Latin because the word for a donkey or a jackass in Latin is a very common term of abuse. This is from the dictionary, a dolt, a simpleton, a blockhead. So donkey was kind of the best I could come up with. Here's another one. This is actually one from Cicero himself, quoted by Quintilian. Let's say you're in trouble, or somebody's telling you something you don't believe. We can rebut somebody's nonsense by pretending we're in agreement. For example, when this guy's wife claimed to be 30 years old, Cicero quipped, "It's true. I've been hearing her say that for 20 years now." So that one works pretty well today. Okay, here we go. Okay, if these are the kind of jokes that the Romans preserved, maybe you think they're funny, maybe you think they're not so funny, you're not so sure. Why study these things? What's the purpose of a book like this today? Cicero has one of his characters address that very question. And the guy says, my own view of studying humor is that the power, the value of rules for humor is not that textbooks can help us figure out what to say. In other words, textbooks are not going to help you generate jokes all that well. They can, but that's not really the point. The point is that once you have something to say, once you have a joke, from sheer inspiration, from searching the internet, from thinking hard, from stealing it from somebody else, whatever it's going to be, once you have a joke, we can then have the confidence that it's right, or we can understand that it's not the right kind of joke to tell, since we'll have learned a standard to check it against. So now that we know what the rules are for, both authors give us a long series of the different kinds of jokes. And I actually had the great fortune to consult with Joel Stein, this amazing humorist writer. He wrote for 17 years the humor column at Time magazine. He writes for sitcoms. He writes all over the place. And I shared some of this with him in manuscript. And he said, some of this stuff is identical to what we have in the sitcom writer's room out there in Hollywood. We have labels for jokes. These guys have labels for jokes. It works pretty much the same way. Some of them are different, but they work. They're like math formulas. Okay, so one of them, so he says the funniest joke is going to be one where a funny remark. He says every funny remark sometimes gets its funniness from the thing or the situation, and sometimes a funny remark gets it from the language. But people love it when laughter is provoked by combining the situation and the language. Now, this is really interesting, and it explains kind of my own career. I love puns. Puns are supremely clever. They're in the language, not the category, the thing category. But they often don't get big laughs so much as compliments. People say, oh, that's clever. Ha ha, cute. For example, this soldier Titius liked to kick a soccer ball around at night, and he was suspected of breaking some important statues. When his friends asked why he hadn't shown up for his platoon's morning workout, this other guy, Terentius Vespa, quipped, "Oh, it's okay. He said he broke an arm." I like that a lot. This one gets mixed responses. Here's another one. This guy Philippus told a smelly guy, he says, "It seems you've goat me surrounded." The Romans are always making jokes about smelling like goats, I guess, if these people don't shower often enough. So funny, not so funny, take your pick. Here's another one. I had to change some of the proper names in the dialogue to make them work with some of the jokes built in. So there's a lawyer named Barker. Barker told a certain bad orator. What Barker told a certain bad orator belongs in the same category. In the finale of a speech, the man thought he'd moved his audience to pity. Once he sat down, he asked Barker, "Do you think I moved them to pity?" "Oh, hell yeah," replied Barker. "I don't think anyone's so hard-hearted that they didn't find your speech pitiful." So again, as in, you can see, as in English, it's the last word where the punchline, the sting in the tail kind of lies. Okay. In the last few jokes, I hope you get a sense already of the social power of jokes. Jokes are powerful. They can be like bullets. They can be like traps to trap somebody. I want to show you a couple more examples. This is one of the more famous ones from ancient Rome. Another example is Nasica's classic. This guy Nasica had come to the house of the poet Ennius. And when he asked for Ennius at the front gate, the maid said he wasn't home. Nasica sensed that she'd actually said that at her master's behest, and that Ennius really was inside. So a few days later, when Ennius came to Nasica's house and asked for him at the front door, Nasica shouted, "I'm not home." Then Ennius said, "Huh? I recognize your voice." "You son of a bitch," replied Nasica. "When I came looking for you, I believed your maid that you weren't home. Aren't you going to believe me myself?" Look at this is like President Gordon Gee's joke. With a single joke, you convey everything. You sized up the situation, you can see what happened, and the entire social dynamic does a 180-degree turn. Here's one more, it's one of my favorites. The absolute best, says Quintilian, is hoisting a faker by his own petard. So there's this guy, Domitius Afer. He once demonstrated. Afer had drawn up his will long ago. He's an old guy. Domitius Afer had drawn up his will long ago. And one of his newer friends hoped to finagle something by getting him to reassign his bequests. So the guy concocted a story. And he went to ask Afer's advice. He says, "Hey, Mr. Afer, you know, there's this elderly officer. He's already drawn up his will, but should I have him arrange for his sort of absolute last and final wishes?" "Don't," replied Afer. "You're offending him." Boom. That is the bullet that shatters the illusion of social life. So I came across a quote not long ago in an author from late antiquity, a guy named Lactantius. And he writes, apropos of something else, "I wish, therefore, Cicero would for a short time rise from the dead." And boy, I haven't forgotten this quote because it inspires me. I think there's so much wisdom accumulated in all these rules that that's what we're going to do. We're going to bring old Cicero back and put him to work. So I said at the beginning of this talk that I teamed up with Cornell. That's the business executive education arm of Cornell University. What they aim to do is produce actionable skills for the clients all around the world who want to try and polish up their professional life. And we think this is going to work. So you say, what? Cicero in executive education? And I say, you bet. This is the best opportunity, the single best opportunity, to put Cicero's techniques to use today, to make ancient Rome seem less remote and more alive to people all around the planet. Remember, Cicero was the president of ancient Rome. He wasn't some academic like Quintilian or me just sitting in an office. He was the man in the arena, the guy trying these things out. He had the guts to tell jokes at a murder trial. And he actually tried these things. So what are we doing? We split it up into two different courses, two-part course. The first is using humor for influence, how people can tell jokes of their own to get ahead in interviews, job careers, opportunities, and so on. And the second course is going to be humor in the workplace. How do you tell a joke that will make everyone feel welcome, creative, not alienate anybody? How do you defuse somebody else's mortifying joke when they tell some horrible joke at the interview dinner, and so on? So we think there's a lot of wisdom here. So far, there's been a ton of fun. And it actually, we all sort of think it's actually really working. Been partnered up with some really clever, creative, inspirational people. And so it'll launch in a month or so, and we'll find out how well it's working. So that's it. That's all I have for my talk. And the question now is, any questions from you? I'd be happy to do my best answering. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing if I can get my cursor back. Thank you.
That was awesome, Mike. Thank you so much. And there are some questions. Let me get us started here. Can you say more about how this book grows out of your work in various roles in Cornell's central administration? I think that is a joke.
It is. We call that the poison chalice. But no, it's a really important question. I'm glad you asked. Thank you. So I did a variety of different roles, but one that I did for about 4 years was leading in the leadership of the Faculty Senate. This is a volunteer organization we have. It's like student council for kids, but it's for faculty members. And the first thing I learned is that we have all these amazing people around Cornell, but nobody knows each other. So we had all these endless ad hoc meetings of different people, and we have total strangers come in. And everybody's a little tense. Everybody seems a little awkward. They're not totally sure how to act. And in my own experience, I thought telling a little warm-up joke saved the day innumerable times. It tended to put people at ease, say, hey, we're all just here trying to do our best. We're all volunteers trying to move the university forward. There were some other examples. And I'll tell you one that this was a really winning joke. I was involved with trying to renovate a big auditorium on campus. And this was a big, big, big project, very expensive. And we came to a meeting with the architect, who's a very charismatic gentleman. And he said, we got some really great news on the ceiling tiles. They're, instead of being $5 each, they're $1 each. You're gonna save a ton of money. So that's great. And he said, well, don't get too excited because we're about to spend it on those chairs that we didn't budget for. And it doesn't have to be a belly laugh, but it has to be enough to deliver the bad news with a smile, that it really just resets the room. And so one thing I'd love to see is more of us trying it. We don't want to be stand-up comedians, right? The goal is not to be buffoons. That's what the book keeps saying. But just enough to let everybody know that the sky is still blue. We're all just regular people, and we're all trying to do our best.
Yeah, I agree. We could talk more about that, but let me get some questions from audience members. Do you have a favorite joke by the Romans?
Hey, that's a really great, do I? In the book, the one I keep circling back to is the teenagers in Tarentum, the high stakes joke, where these guys are busted for drinking too much and saying terrible things about the king, and they have no way out. And so they basically, what do they tell the king? Oh man, come on, we were drinking, we're idiots. If we hadn't stopped, it would have just kept going, and we all know we weren't really going to do anything about this. And the king himself laughs because the king himself realizes he's just a person too. So that it may not be the sort of the thigh slapping joke. In fact, I say a little bit about that at the beginning of the book. So aside from the jokes in this book, there's this huge tradition in Rome of jokes told just to make people laugh. There's all these Shakespeare-style stage comedies, about 27 stage comedies, and there's satire and all kinds of stuff. But Cicero and Quintilian are focused exclusively on jokes for winning friends and influencing people. It's not just to make people laugh, but it's all about influence. That's the goal.
Another question.
Sure.
I'm wondering if Cicero mentions multilingual jokes or puns in his work. or
That's a
humorous misunderstandings that arise when one person mishears another. Um,
so
and the person asked, sorry, and the person asked because they were watching the auto-generated subtitles during the talk, and a few times they auto-corrected Cicero to sister, and Cicero has to scissor hands, and that definitely made me chuckle.
Oh, that's great. So autocorrect and Siri and all these applications are hilarious. Watch this. I'm going to try one right now. You're at a library, right? If the librarian says no speaking aloud, let's see how the transcript spells aloud. It can go either way, right?
Yeah.
But so the answer to the question is absolutely yes. I actually, the book I wrote about 10 or 11 or 12 years ago has a whole chapter on misheard words. Exactly, they're called mondegreens. That's the technical fancy name for these things. Like where Jimi Hendrix says, "Excuse me while I kiss this guy," or "There's a bathroom on the right." There's a famous letter Cicero wrote to his friend Papirius Paitus, where he says, he quotes all these Greek words, and he says, "This is like the filthiest, most obscene language in the world." He said, "Well, that's all in Greek." And so there are words in Greek that sound obscene in Latin, but that's not why he's quoting them. And he uses it for a Stoic argument on this. He's trying to prove that obscenity doesn't exist and so on. So it's quite an interesting letter, but that did not make it into the book for this stuff.
A related question. Did Cicero borrow from the Greeks? People like Aristophanes, for instance.
So Cicero definitely borrowed from the Greeks, but not from Aristophanes. There's no real evidence that anyone read Aristophanes in Rome pretty much ever on the Latin side of the tradition. That said, Cicero in his treatise is drawing definitely on Greek writers. He may not be too explicit about it, but there are commentaries that will show you exactly where he's drawing on lost Greek textbooks, and we can see the different philosophical distinctions he's making. That's why in the book I've inserted numbers in brackets to correspond there. The most famous treatise of the ancient world about humor was by Aristotle, the second book of the Poetics. If you've seen The Name of the Rose, this great movie, read the book, that's the treatise that the guy's eating at the end. And so we don't actually know what Aristotle said, but we have some other people that quoted, we think, what Aristotle says, and you can line some of that up here. The most interesting thing I'll just add on is we found this in connection with E. Cornell. A lot of offices around the world struggle with how far to allow humor or to forbid humor. And there's a passage in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, basically a big book on ethics. And Aristotle says, yeah, should we legislate joking and not joking? Well, it's really not clear. So at the end of the day, he says that, a gentleman or a respectable person will legislate for him or herself how far to take the joking. So the HR department shouldn't feel bad because in 2,300 years, we still haven't gotten too far.
There are many good jokes. I'm trying jokes and questions. I'm trying to not jump around too much. I'll have to pass a comment on from Aiden, who asked, what type of Tarantine joke can remedy a 0.15 freshman GPA dip?
So one thing Quintilian says, Aiden, is that you never joke about heinous crime. And a 1.5 GPA is sounding like heinous crime here. So I'm not sure humor is the way to get going on that one. A new major, maybe. But, there we are.
So surprise seems to be a key component of successful humor. And does Cicero or the Romans value surprise in their culture or mythologies?
That question didn't go where I thought it was going to go. Did they value surprise? The most surprising thing is there isn't even a word in Latin for surprise. They use this phrase, which means sort of counter to expectation, and it kind of means surprise. But they don't have a word for it. I'm trying. In general, do they value it? I would say probably not really. I mean, Rome was a fairly rigidly traditional society. I'm sure there were, forward thinkers and free thinkers and liberals of all kinds, but the literature that we get tends to value tradition and hewing to it, and shocking one's family in various ways doesn't seem to be a big part of it. That said, whoever made the comment, surprise, that's exactly right. Surprise is fundamental to humor. People have thought a lot about humor and how it works. We don't really have a lot of great ideas, but it basically seems to ram two matrices by thought together simultaneously. So a train jumps tracks in a way you don't expect, like no speaking aloud, right? Or if I say, I saw the magician, saw the woman, you probably have trouble processing that sentence. But if I say, I saw the magician, saw the woman on stage, it gets a little easier, right? And did you know that saw could mean two different things in English? Most speakers don't. And so all jokes are trying to capitalize on that stuff and make you think in a new way. And that's why they're so good for creativity.
Did Cicero ever do self-deprecating humor?
That's a great question. The answer is they say never do that. In public speaking, you don't want to tell a self-deprecating joke. They're adamant. Cicero and Quintilian, they say if you start telling jokes at your own expense, people are going to start making jokes about you. So don't do that. There are some exceptions, and that's when you've been trapped. Like if you tell a joke and it misfires badly, at that point, that's where you do want to try and make a joke at your own expense, and to kind of counter for it. There's a classic one. You say, you know, before I came here, I was talking with my family. I was so nervous, and I said, oh, I don't know what to say. And they say, don't try and be funny, just be yourself. That usually gets people chuckling and distracted, and things can move on from there.
Are there modern comedians whose work resembles ancient comedy?
Well, so ancient comedy, I think by that probably we mean ancient jokes of the kind in this book. That's a slightly technical term. In case you meant ancient comedy of the kind that I study most of the time, that stuff we would say is the movies, right? Sitcoms and that sort of thing. So definitely, the Romans had their own sitcoms, except they performed them on stage. Those are the 27, 28 of them that we have. For these kind of jokes, modern comedians that tell these, definitely, I mean, there are stand-up comedians that tell jokes pretty much like this. There's even a section in Quintilian where there seems to be some comedian named Gaba. And this guy lived at the time of Augustus, and he was legendary for his jokes. He seems to have been kind of a Bob Hope type figure. That said, the kind of jokes that I associate with somebody like a Dave Chappelle, it's hard to find that kind of edgy humor. We think it existed in the street performances, what the Romans called mime, but we have almost no remains of that. So we just have to use our best guess for that kind of thing.
There's a comment, stand-up console reminds this listener of Mel Brooks' stand-up philosopher Comicus in History of the World Part 1.
I love it. It's true. Stand-up comedy is, in a lot of ways, I talk a tiny bit about this at the end, but I've gotten fascinated with this. Stand-up comedy is as close as to public philosophy as we have in the current moment. I think Dave Chappelle himself said that recently. This is how people say edgy, dangerous things, and then they follow it with a punchline to give themselves plausible deniability. But this is how you serve up the hard truths about life to people. And you try and make them laugh about some of the miseries of life, otherwise everybody starts crying. But this is a way to get people thinking. But yeah, the stand-up consul, a consul of ancient Rome who acted like a stand-up comedian. Imagine that.
And we have a question about politics, now that we've sort of drifted into that. Do you believe the former president had a similar approach to Cicero? Because Cicero has this sort of relentless ridiculing his opponents?
So the answer is yes, without reservation. In fact, this book was commissioned during the last presidential cycle, a year and change ago. And so I actually have a blog post that may eventually go live. If we publish it, we may not. But I think there's no question that hands down, Donald Trump told jokes more effectively in the style that Cicero is talking about them than any public figure I can ever possibly imagine. But it is also, I say right away, it's not just the United States. In Ukraine, they elected recently a prime minister who was a comedian. There have been other examples in the United States. Al Franken, as you may remember, here in the US, but in Italy recently, they had someone who made it very close to the top telling jokes. So yes, and the question is, are you telling jokes to win influence and win for the moment? Plutarch is unambiguous. He says that is what Cicero did. He told jokes to win trials, to win elections.
Did Cicero make jokes about doctors and healthcare or even plague?
Did Cicero make jokes about doctors or healthcare? Plague? No, there were no plagues in his time. There were plagues in Rome later, but not, I think, no jokes associated. It wasn't a laughing matter. There's a Roman proverb that I've been unable to source, but I think it's authentic, that says only the doctor kills with impunity. I've told that to doctors where they seem to think it's quite funny, but if you're looking about gallows humor, that I think is hard to find. I'm trying to think. Medicine, no. There is, however, if your interest is this kind of thing, there's a comedy by this person, Plautus, the comedian, the other funniest person in history, called Curculio. And the entire thing takes place at a healing shrine in Epidaurus, which is one of the more famous places people go on a tour of Greece these days. There's a big famous theater there. And the play is set there. And a guy goes because he's having kidney failure, liver failure. And there's all these jokes made there about doctors and faith healing and the inefficacy and so on. So that's a great thing to read if you're looking for that kind of humor.
I have a question about a recent book. Let me just find it. Have you read Humor Seriously? And if you have, do you have any thoughts?
I haven't read it yet. Who's the author? Do we know who that is?
I don't know who it is. Someone Google it.
I'll find out, and I appreciate the recommendation, whoever has brought it to me. I appreciate that, and I will follow up on that.
Okay. All right. More questions, and I'm trying to keep up with all the questions. Did something like improv humor exist in ancient Rome?
Did improv exist? I mean, the short answer is it must have, but we don't actually know that much about it. This is, again, as close to the street performances as we can think of. The stage comedies that we have are all entirely scripted. There is actually quite a large segment of my narrow subspecialty, some colleagues of mine, who think that all that scripted stuff is influenced by an improv style from Italy called Italian farce. And it's a great theory. We just don't actually have any of the Italian farce to tell us whether we're correct or not. So it's plausible, could be true, it might be true, but we don't know. But it seems likely. One of my joys here at Cornell is I'm the advisor for the Whistling Shrimp, which is one of the two comedy groups. I'm also the advisor for Humor Us, which is not improv, but both of these have incredibly amusing comic styles. So anybody listening, make sure you check out the Whistling Shrimp. Make sure you check out Humor Us.
Awesome, thank you. I didn't know about those groups. All right, so another question, a really good one. It appears that there is always a chance of backfiring with humor, especially in high stake or tense scenarios. And in fact, we see Cicero losing his life because of doing just that. And so do you have tips or advice to navigate those tense scenarios more effectively?
So yes, the first time you ever want to tell a joke, like a high stakes joke, you got to identify your goal, right? I mean, what do you want out of telling this joke? If you're losing an argument, I have a go-to joke that I always use in these circumstances. And everybody listening should find a go-to joke that works for them in these circumstances. But if you are, let's say, in a debate around the boardroom table with a bunch of people, and everybody wants to spend 10 million on this, and you think it's a huge mistake, if that's the kind of thing, you can tell the kind of joke that will make everybody reverse their thinking instantly. You might not win, but it's worth a try. And I'll just say in Cicero's case, Cicero, I would not hesitate to call him martyr. So he saw the Roman Republic collapsing, and he thought that the rise of Julius Caesar and this guy Mark Antony was so dire and so serious a threat to what we would call a democracy that he gave these blistering speeches. He had to know that he was putting his life on the line, but to him it seemed worth trying to do. He took it way too far, but I don't think he necessarily would have regretted that. So if it's your own case, you want to think, first you identify your goal, and then you think short-term, long-term. You might win the short-term debate, but what's going to happen down the line, right? The most famous joke of all that I can think of, and this is what I'm going to talk about in the blog post with Donald Trump, it was in the Republican primary, where he was asked by the moderator, he said, Donald Trump, you said these appalling things about women, terrible things about women. You've called them this, you've called them that, you called them this. And he interrupted, he said, only about Rosie O'Donnell. And the whole room erupted into infectious laughter. And you know what happened after that? It was the most powerful, high risk, high stakes joke I've ever seen. That absolutely was like hitting the baseball when it's coming super fast and reversing all the momentum. But so you got to think about the long term, short term, that kind of
thing. Yeah. We've got more information about Humor Seriously, a full title. Humor Seriously, for people that are listening, might want to check the book out. Humor Seriously, Why Humor is a Secret Weapon in Business and Life, and How Anyone Can Harness It, Even You. And it's by Jennifer Aker and Naomi Bagdanos. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think they're out of Stanford. That book was in the works, I think. Okay, now I will check it out. Thank you.
And I will make sure that the library has a copy of it. While we're talking about books related to humor, have you read Jokester by Isaac Asimov?
Ooh, probably a while back. I think so, but I wouldn't want to speak authoritatively to that.
Okay, well, that's all right. Another one for the audience to check out, maybe. Another joke. I keep calling our questions jokes. Okay, another question from Verity Platt. Do the Romans have much to say about punching up or punching down?
I love the question. Thank you, Verity. Quintilian says don't punch down. I even translated the phrase that way. I don't know that I could find, I've got the book here, but I don't think I'm going to be able to find it quickly enough for you. But without any hesitation, he says, never make fun of somebody's misery or lot in life. Nobody thinks that's funny. And he says, you don't want to punch down on people. He says you can punch, he said there are exceptions though. He says when somebody becomes what we would call the humble brag. I don't think I translated that. I regret not translating that. I meant to. But when somebody's, sort of signaling, you know what a humble brag is from the word alone, even if you don't know maybe the word. So he says that's an exception, but otherwise he says don't do that. That won't work. And it's cruel to make fun of somebody's lot in life.
All right, so we've got one, I think I've got everybody's questions. I think this is our last one. Did Cicero's humor influence Ovid's humor?
Oof. Boy, that's a good question. My inclination reflexively is to say no. However, Ovid trained as an orator, as a lawyer, as a young man. He tells us that in his autobiography. If you don't know it, it's Tristia 4.10. Ovid talks about his early training. He says they were basically, I was sent off to law school. That's what all the students were meant to do back then. But then I wound up being a poet because everything that fell out of my mouth was a verse. Now, you say, why would it be Cicero? Well, because Cicero became an instant classic. Immediately, his speeches became textbooks almost immediately. Cicero died in 40, or he was killed in 43, which is, I think, the year Ovid was born, if I have my dates right. And in that case, it seems highly likely that Ovid either would have read Cicero's speeches as a student, or he would have read the lost collection of Cicero's best quips. So Cicero had this secretary, a guy named Tiro, and Tiro assembled after Cicero died all of his boss's best quips. And that's Quintilian was quoting from it in his treatise. It eventually went missing, but it survived all the way through late antiquity into the 5th century. So it seems hard to believe Ovid would not have looked at it, but Ovid was so funny in his own right, he might not have.
All right, another question has come in. Were there any stereotypes in Rome about where in the empire the funniest people came from? For instance, were Gauls and barbarians considered wildly funny? Or did the Romans have a superiority complex about their own sense of humor?
So that's a great question. The answer is yes, they definitely did, but it's not the Gauls and it's not the barbarians. There are 4 places they single out. Athens for its wit, its sophisticated humor. And then Sicily is always considered hilarious for some reason. There are a couple of Sicilian jokes in the book. And then Rhodes, the island of Rhodes, and Byzantium, which we now call it Istanbul. Back then, it was a pretty small settlement. It later became Constantinople. But for some reason, those 4 places were associated with humor. And there's one more place, and much later than Cicero, the Emperor Julian passed through a town that was famous for having a hilarious sort of party outlook on life. I grew up in New Orleans, so I totally get this, right? It's like you grew up in Las Vegas or New Orleans. You understand what people mean. And it's somewhere in Turkey today, and I just can't remember off the top of my head where it is. But they definitely did have stereotypes like that.
I'm just making sure that I think I've got all the questions. I'm seeing lots of comments from people about how much they enjoyed the talk and how much giggling there was behind the scenes. It's a shame that Zoom has not figured out how to allow giggles and laughter. We can do hand clapping, but that's about it. I think I've got all of the questions, and I would like to thank you, and let's give a warm round of virtual applause. And I want to thank the audience for joining us today, and remind you that the recorded version of today's talk will be available on the CUL YouTube channel in a couple of weeks if you want to share it with friends and family who couldn't make it today. And I'm going to get a slide up if I can to show you the rest of our talks coming up. As you can see, we have 3 more talks in the chats in the Stack series this semester. And so I hope you will consider joining us for those as well. For the links for more information and to register for those talks can be found in the link in your chat box. And I think we got that link there. Maybe one of my assistants can get that link. I think, yes, there it went. So have a wonderful evening, day, morning, whatever time it is where you are, and goodbye. And thank you so much for joining us.